I don't know, 4 or 5-ish. All right, meeting's live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of our panel discussion series here on Exordium with Mazel Tov. My name is Ahmed Shafkat Hassan. I am the, oh, no, I'm supposed to wait. Am I waiting? Tell me when. Go, go, go. All right, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. This is Ahmed Shafkat Hassan from Mazel Tov. I am the strategic director, and welcome to the third panel discussion series with Exordium. Our illustrious panel today, as you can see, involves incredible people from all around the world. We're going to be talking about climate change and its impacts on human lives. We're going to try our best and remain as apolitical as possible, as always, but in doing so and in recognition of the fact that ultimately climate change is a political topic, we are going to try and not point fingers, but definitely try our best at trying to figure out solutions as we move forward. Given that my intro is out of the way, I am going to pass the ball or baton, however you want to take it, to the panelists one by one. I'll have Julie come on first, introduce herself, and then we can move on to the others as well. Julie, go on.
I had a feeling you were going to say me first for some reason.
Yeah.
My name is Julie Capivari. I have been working at the United Nations Development Program for the past 2 years. I work on an e-learning platform called Learning for Nature. And our mission is to create e-learning content and free online courses that's open and accessible to the public, but is catered mostly towards policymakers and biodiversity practitioners. I work closely with another team called the Equator Initiative, which gives a prize and uplifts the voices of Indigenous people and local communities across the world who are implementing an extraordinary nature-based solution. And a few years ago, I graduated from Cornell University studying environmental science, and I'll be pursuing a master's in international affairs soon. Currently, I'm based in Long Island, New York, and I'm really, really excited to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation.
We are delighted to have you. Along with Julie, we have Flavia joining us all the way from Brazil. Flavia, take it away.
Yes, hi, hello. Thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here with you all. So I'm Flavia. I'm currently 32 years old. I graduated as a law, so I'm a lawyer, and I have a master's degree in international development on sustainability, environment, and politics at the University of Birmingham. And I just find out that Fiona is there in my kind of second hometown, so it's really nice to connect. And since I came back to Brazil, I co-founded 2 startups, one called Youth Climate Leaders, that will provide climate change education for young people and help them to start their careers as climate leaders. And also La Clima, that is an organization that we gather lawyers and law students around Brazil. We are now around 400 people in our network, and all of them pro bono help our country in a way to develop our path in a net zero way of going. And also in the past years, I've been working with climate change projects, international corporations. I am currently a climate policy manager at Climate Reality here in Brazil, but also I've been working at ICLEI and other international organizations focused on urban sustainable agenda for municipalities and governments around Brazil.
All right, thank you, Flavia, for joining us. Along with her, we've got Angelique Popnu joining us from Seychelles. Angelique, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Greetings, everyone. Hi from the Seychelles. And thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today. So as already mentioned, my name is Angelique Pouponneau, and I'm a lawyer by profession. University in the UK, called there, and then started practicing in Seychelles. I have a master's in environmental law, very much focused on natural resources law and law of the sea. After the master's, I had a great opportunity to also be a fellow for the Alliance of Small Island States in New York, which is where I've been trained up to be a climate change negotiator and been following adaptation and loss and damage and a bit of climate finance in the climate space. Yeah, when I was in Seychelles, when I returned to Seychelles initially, I've co-founded a youth-led NGO to support young people to advance sustainable development. And right now, currently managing a trust fund that supports conservation and climate adaptation projects. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Angelique. We're now going to move on to a neighbor, actually, Sidra Adil. Go ahead.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Sidra Adil. I actually have an undergrad in environmental engineering, and then I went on to do a master's in climate change science and policy as a Commonwealth Shared Scholar. My research interests back during my master's were centered on vulnerability and poverty and heat stress. I currently work as a researcher for the University of Bristol and Collective for Social Science Research in Pakistan. I work full-time there. I work as a researcher in poverty and how we can inform crisis response and disaster resilience in Pakistan, especially for flood responses and of course the pandemic, how we can work around that by using energy proxies to predict poverty basically. And in the future, I actually aim on working alongside vulnerability experts in the fields of heat stress and how Pakistan can actually work around that, because we are in the middle of a heat wave right now, most of the country. That's something I'm working on. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sidra. And finally, friend and someone who's actually joined me at Durham University during my master's, Fiona, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I'm super impressed with everyone because I'm just thinking like, wow, I'm a forester, so I plant trees for a living. I just plant trees like all day, every day. So it's really cool talking to people who are in such varied fields. Anyway, more about myself, I guess. I did a languages degree at the University of Warwick, so I speak German as well as English. And then I did the master's in Durham with Shath, and my master's was in education. And I suppose you might be wondering, does this have to do with climate change? And I basically got interested in sustainability because I had this incredible module in my final year of my undergraduate degree on sustainability. And that made me become a climate activist because we were forced to read well, not forced to, I voluntarily chose the module. But we were made to read the IPCC report on the special report on global warming. And that kind of gave me this sort of brainwave, like, wow, okay, I need to do stuff. So that made me then join a few activist organizations at Durham University. And part of that was sort of environment education activism as well. So I got involved in writing a new module for Durham University and working in their sustainability team and reviewing the curriculum. So my main, I suppose, climate change emphasis is in education. And then after that, I graduated and I now work for a tree planting charity in the UK. Oh yeah, one more thing, I suppose, to do with the human rights side of things. I also volunteer at the Coventry Refugee and Migrant Centre teaching English, so I'm a teacher as well. So yeah, cool. Nice to meet you all.
And amongst all of these amazing people, I am definitely the fraudster. I do not specialize in climate change in many ways. My nexus in climate change comes from discussing human rights. It has been my opinion for the longest time that climate change has been obviously a threat to human lives in many ways. My research primarily discusses the replacement of using typical climate-centric or environment law-centric climate change advocacy with more of a human rights-based advocacy. So on that front, we're going to start off the discussion on that with that. J.F. Knox, the UN rapporteur for climate change environment law, actually, back in, I think, 2012, 2014, spoke quite heavily about why we need to start considering a human rights rhetoric for climate change. And one of the first things that he made in his submission to the 21st COP with the United Nations Frameworks for Climate Change conferences, I think is the full form of that, was that because of the impact that climate change ultimately has on human lives, human rights ultimately needs to become a part of that discourse. This has been a it's been a relatively played around topic for the last 4 decades or so, but what's astounding to recognize is that there has been very little work done on this in terms of how we adapt policies, in terms of how we adapt laws and legal structures. Given that my knowledge in climate change is relatively limited, I'm going to defer to my incredible panelists for a vast majority of that knowledge. What I will say, however, is that for a basis of this conversation, there are effectively and predominantly 3 ways in which climate change impacts human rights, and we'd love to talk a bit more about this at length. It impacts civil and political rights to some degrees in some instances. It predominantly impacts social, economic, and cultural rights, and in most instances, it impacts rights belonging to individuals who belong to a certain group or groups of certain types of individuals. What we see as a problem ultimately is that in all 3 of these categories, there is an underlying impact on the right to life, right to health, and right to subsistence. We're going to try and unpack these issues as much as we can in terms of trying to think about how we can come up with sustainable solutions, sustainable policy. My overarching discussion of research has typically been around the lines of, look, there's already an incredible and robust human rights framework that exists throughout the world that has been adopted by a vast majority of countries. Why not just dovetail on that? Because it makes a lot of things easier for us to address. It makes a lot of governments develop mandate, because there's one thing to talk about the impact on the planet, and as important as it might be, it's very difficult for certain individuals, especially at least in the country that I come from, Bangladesh. It's very difficult to explain to someone who's having to fight for their physiological security as to why they should care about the safety of a tree. So it's very important, I think, to have these discussions and talk about it from a more human-centric point of view. Climate change has been I can never pronounce this right. It's an Anthropocene something, but the point is human beings to a large extent contributed to climate change, and therefore the response must be to some degree on that front where we address human necessities. So given that everyone apart from me has actually delved into proper climate change advocacy, I would love to start off this discussion with the 2 individuals who work closer with educating individuals, because I think developing a mandate becomes very important. So I'll ask Fiona to take it off first, and then we'll come to Julie. How has teaching about climate change worked, and how have we typically, what have we seen as barriers to getting people to actually care about climate change advocacy? So Fiona.
Good question. Where do I start? So I suppose I start with what I know about climate crisis education. So I'll talk about my dissertation. For anybody who knows Shaf loves dissertations. So my dissertation was on the climate crisis education. So what that means was I essentially interviewed a whole bunch of teachers in the UK in primary schools and secondary schools, and I asked them what they already taught their children about the climate crisis and what they thought about it. And in a way, it was a really positive piece of research, because all of the people I interviewed, which wasn't a huge sample, but they all said, yeah, it's really important. We want to teach more about it. We're just not sure how. And a lot of those teachers didn't feel like they had the power to, change the curriculum or ask managers at their school how to incorporate it more. So I suppose it's really tricky on a global scale to say oh, this is exactly what we need to do, because obviously every approach is different for each country. But the thing that I felt best that would work would be kind of tailoring climate crisis education towards each group of people, which might sound kind of obvious, but what I mean by that is obviously starting young, primary schools, getting people outdoors as much as you can, secondary schools, having summer camps and things that rather than changing the whole kind of system, which is just, everyone talks about changing the system all the time, which would be amazing, but we have to work with what we have at the moment. So things like, really immersive summer camps and curriculum change. And then actually, I think the final for me, one of the most important things about climate crisis education is everybody talks about how important it is for children, but the people who need to be educated most are adults, because we are the ones in power at the moment, and climate crisis is imminent. It's like happening right now. So I think for me, actually, when we talk about climate crisis education, I just think it has to be kind of radical in the sense that maybe take a form that people haven't thought of before. So, you know, who's in power at the moment? People in governments. How do we educate those people in government to care about the natural world? And like you were saying, Ashaf, the word you were looking for was anthropocentric. So, you know, human based. How do you teach somebody to value a tree? Well, I suppose you have to go at that question from an anthropocentric point of view, which is, how do you teach somebody to value the natural capital that tree gives you? So in economic terms, how much is a tree worth? Because humans talk in money, right? So if you can say that tree is worth £100,000, people suddenly care about protecting it. So I think education, for me, it's about making people understand just how valuable the natural environment is. And it's as simple as that, really. I'd love to know, what Julie, you think, obviously, because you actually work in, you know, education, whereas I just think a lot about it.
Yeah, you're definitely right that those in government need to step up and take the initiative. Mostly what I've been working on lately is exactly that kind of adult learning, training policymakers, training those in the field on nuanced issues in sustainable development so that they can find solutions that are based in nature and that fit them in their national context and their local context. And that type of education is not often very accessible. It's really important to have that out and free and accessible to the public so that those who are motivated take it. But it's a good question. How do you convince those who are not motivated to take it? And I think the most important, or maybe the most strategic way to get people to care is about ownership. I feel like a lot of Western views don't really have humans as part of nature, and we don't feel like we can really, we don't really feel like we own our natural resources, and that therefore we don't take responsibility for the impacts that it has. As soon as we start to realize what our actual ecological footprint is, even just on an individual scale, it gives us more accountability, because then we realize the full life cycle of maybe that apple that we ate. It's almost impossible to know, though. But I want to talk about ownership because another group that I work with fairly closely, a demographic that I work with pretty closely, is Indigenous peoples. And I start to question, why do they care about their natural resources, but we don't care, I guess, from a Western view, about natural resources. And Indigenous peoples care, and they are considered stewards of biodiversity, and they are considered those who mitigate climate change on a fairly global scale, is because they feel that they are very close to their land, and they feel like they have a close relationship with nature, well, what we call nature, I guess. And so I really think it's important for people to find out maybe where their food comes from, where their clothes come from, just as like a very small step, and look at the same philosophical ideals that Indigenous peoples have, where they do not exploit or overexploit their environment. They directly depend on it, and they have a relationship with it on a cultural and spiritual level, and they have so much knowledge of it, so they can see and witness what direct impacts they could have on it, and they see the direct impacts that outside companies and corporations and mining operations and oil operations have on their land too. So they put two and two together. It's really important to bridge this cognitive dissonance that we have about our consumption and the impact that it has on nature. So as soon as we educate about that, which is probably the hardest thing to do, then and only then can we actually make a significant enough change. But I really liked what you said, Fiona, about youth taking a really important role in trying to convince those currently in power to make this type of change, because I feel like youth are more open to learning about this thing. I wanted to hear from Flavia, not to take away the facilitator role, but I know that she's working with the youth climate leaders.
Absolutely. Little do we all, I mean, I don't know if Flavia's spoken about it already, but Flavia actually has a lot of experience developing mandate for climate change as well. She ran for councillor in her constituency, which is, I think, an interesting experience. So as someone who's actually had firsthand experience in developing mandate or trying to get people to work on climate change as an issue in that political forum, Flavia, I'd love to hear from you. Go for it.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with Fiona and Julie said regarding like education and the importance of it. We need education in order to move forward on climate change agenda, you know, otherwise it's really hard to connect. And even that education, it depends. You have to understand who you are talking to so you can adapt the language and everything else, because it's a complex issue and we need empathy to understand with who we are talking to. So I think we can create a better connection. When I did my master's, I focused on climate justice, and my thesis was about that. I went to Mozambique to analyze a climate adaptation program of the government, and I went to the communities to see if human rights was being respected on the field once that policy was developed. And the answer was no. I couldn't see human rights in based approach on how the policies were being taken on the ground. So I came back to Brazil with that, you know, something deep down inside me saying, come back to Brazil to start developing climate justice there. And I was like, oh my God, how is that possible? It's even harder to talk about environment issues here. Can you imagine climate justice, something even new? So I came here, and that's how one of the reasons why Youth Climate Leaders exist. With three other amazing women, we co-founded. They started already the idea, and I came a little bit later, like 2 months later, once the idea was already there. And since then, we have been providing courses to young people around Brazil and even around the world, because we have YCL labs spread around 4 continents. But here in Brazil, mainly we provide a lot of scholarships in a way that knowledge goes everywhere. Because here in Brazil, if you go to Southeast, you can find better education. You can find in an easy way how to connect with this kind of knowledge. But if you go to the Northeast or like in the countryside of northeast of Brazil or something like that, and young people, they don't have the same opportunities. So we manage in a way to give a lot of scholarships so we can have those kind of young people. And one thing that Julie said, it's about the policymakers. They need to understand. The policymakers, they have to move forward. The policymakers, they must take a climate agenda, and I agree. But those policymakers, it's really hard when it's not already on their heart, let's say, you know, the issue. We need a technical group behind that person in order to move forward the agenda. And last year, when we had municipal elections here in Brazil. And when I say municipal elections, we are talking about 5,700 municipalities in Brazil. It's a lot. I don't remember exactly the number, but it's more than 5,000 municipalities in Brazil. And I lived in São Paulo. In São Paulo, it's around 12 million people. And when I was just seeing the movement of the elections, I couldn't find anyone talking about climate change in a political level, in a political discussion for that election. And that kind of pissed me off a little bit, because I was like, come on, we are like in the middle of the biggest crisis of our century, and I cannot see anyone talking about this. And climate change, it's about economics, it's about health, it's about education, it's about unemployment, migration, it's about so many things. It's about the food that is in your table and the water you have access to, and those who don't have access is still here in Brazil. Climate change, it's a holistic and a systemic approach in a way of seeing societies, the new kind of society in a new kind of world we want to develop. And it's impossible not to have this issue on a political debate. Climate change is already a geopolitical issue. So how on earth, you know, in my country, the people, they are not talking about this. So I thought, okay, someone need to do that. And I decided, after a year thinking, I was brave enough and I decided to run for elections in Brazil, in São Paulo, in a city with 12 million people. And normally they say run for a city councilor in São Paulo is even more difficult than running for like presidency in Brazil, because the competition, it's unbelievable. It's true. It's unbelievable, the competition in São Paulo. I got a license for my job, and I focused like 2 months on developing a climate change campaign here in Brazil. And it was amazing. Really, it was amazing, because at the end we got 5,000 votes, and it's a lot of votes, even though like thinking about the competition, thinking that I am like a normal citizen, I don't have like a political family or a rich family or whatever. I am like a normal citizen in Brazil who works on climate change. So from zero, we got 5,000 votes. And the most interesting part was just like talking to people randomly on the street saying, hi, hello, my name is Flavia, and I'm running for a campaign, blah, blah, blah. So I was trying to approach people and trying to connect with them with climate change. And I came up with an example related like the bus stop with climate change. And when I got to that point of that example, the bus stop, why it's connected with climate change, people, they start like understanding that climate change is their daily problem as well. But more than that, can be their daily solution. Climate change, it's an open window of a lot of possibilities, of new possibilities of developing a new society. So, and it's exciting because of course we got scared. Of course and when we got scared, we kind of paralyzed. But we don't have to be paralyzed right now. We have to act. And in order to act, we have to take out that climate anxiety. That is something that is burning out our young people, not here in Brazil, but all over the world, in order to act. So we have to have a positive approach about climate change if you want to bring people on board. And when I was talking to them, I said, let's see. So the example was like that. We here in São Paulo, we have like the heat waves. It's getting even bigger and more constantly. So in the past, we used to have maybe 50 days in the year with like 40 degrees at 8 a.m. But now it's coming to maybe 8 days actually. And in the next 5 years, it's going to be 120 days with 40 degrees at 9 a.m. But saying this for someone who lives in a house that it's a different kind of roof that melts you inside when it's already hot, and talking to people that goes to the bus stop every single day to go to work, how they are going to go to work, how that journey won't be a healthy and enjoyable journey, you know, because they're going to be melted already once they're at their job. And once I brought the heat wave connecting with the bus stop and how it impacts on their daily lives to go to work, And I was talking to them in a bus stop, and it was already 40 degrees, and it was morning when I was talking to them. So they could see that I wasn't lying, you know, they could see that it was real. And they said, oh my God, that's true. So really, that's going to happen often? I said, yes, it's going to happen often. So what we need to think is, who are you going to vote for? Hopefully you are going to vote for me, but if it's not me, that's okay. But at least just have a look on the proposal of the guy or the girl you are going to vote for, to see if they have climate approach on their program. That's important. And they said, okay, I'm going to have a look, but if they don't have, I might vote for you or not, and that's okay. I think I have three main purposes of running for a campaign. One of them was win the campaign, of course, but in kind of way, I won 5,000 votes, so that is already amazing. But education, I want to have my campaign as a source of education on climate change, you know, in order to, the other topic, bring to the political debate what climate change is. So in a political level, we need to develop every single public policy with the climate lens nowadays. We need that. So it doesn't matter if you are left wing or right wing, or doesn't matter. I used to say that climate change is so cool, but so cool that climate change wants everyone. You know, doesn't matter what kind of ring you are voting for. What we need is to put climate change lens in order to develop every single public policy in my country and in your country. So in that way, I found a way to connect it with people, and it was amazing. I didn't win, but I know there's city councilors around Brazil that they won, and they're using my program to kind of Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, you know, copying the program to bring the climate impacts into their city councilor. Even I'm finding ways to develop like the proposals that I did in my program with the job I'm doing now. There's always a way to do things you want to do. We are able to find out. We as humans, we know how to adapt. We know how to find new solutions. We are creative, and we need that creativity to develop this new world that we really want to. And I'm pretty sure all those amazing women here in that room, and of course, Shaf, but like I'm talking about the speakers, I'm pretty sure you all have an amazing ideas, and we are all full of creativity to help us as humanity, you know, to move forward on climate change agenda. And Fiona, you are not just planting trees. Come on, you are planting trees, and that's amazing. We need everyone. Like, doesn't matter your field, doesn't matter your background, doesn't matter. What matters is that in a way, every one of us find out one path in order to help our world to be carbon neutral zero, but to be more kind and more healthy and everything else. So one day, hopefully we're going to be alive, you know, to see like all those changes that we are working for. And if not, at least we open up some kind of path. So those behind us, the young generation, they're going to find the way easily than us, and that's how it goes. But I encourage you all to run for elections in your country. You know, I encourage, because we all can do that, and I'm here to.
There's an endorsement right there, isn't there?
I'd vote for you, Flavia.
If we ever visit Brazil, if we're allowed to vote, we're definitely voting for you.
You all have home here in
on
Brazil.
That very note. On the note of getting people on the bus to advocating for climate change, one of the things that Flavia does mention is the context of how individuals were forced to look at the bus stop example and how that got their attention. But that is, in many cases, a result of individuals being self-interested in a lot of cases, but that also comes with this structure of vulnerability, and it comes with the structure of how nations develop that. And on that note, I'm going to pass it on to Sidra, who actually researches on the matter. and ask for her opinion on what she thinks. And after that, actually, if it's okay with everyone, we're going to move to Angelique, who is currently in the Seychelles, which as a nation sits with Bangladesh on the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And we'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later. But first, Sidra, your opinions, please.
Hello. Well, as a researcher, you just rely on the data. You see it for what it is. And of course, theoretically, well, this is a very interesting question. But the thing is, with regards to policies and with regards to the power you wield when you vote, the thing is that the people who do stand up and who you do vote for, of course, that does make a very big difference, and what their proposals are and what their ideals are in those proposals. But more often than not, the best case scenario is there will be somebody who will not be well, not like Flavia mentioned, they won't have the financial backing from a wealthy family or people who've always been, generations have been in politics. What really happens is that some of their proposals may be conducive, some of them may not be, some of them may actually have a big role to play in working on certain policies, like especially for Pakistan, for Bangladesh, for some of these regions, for disaster risk, for example. I would just kind of relate it to my own area of research. They do play a part, but the thing is, what we usually lose at is when like Flavia again mentioned, that we need a holistic approach. What we lose at is taking a look at the systemic point of view of everything, because every single part of your life will be endangered as a result of this climate crisis, whether it's health or your food security, everything. And as a researcher, what I can say is that while we can play a role as individuals, but we can't really do much as individuals, because the systems in place make it perfectly legal for big corporations to keep on polluting, to do whatever they want to. Of course, there's advocacy and there's so much stuff that goes on in nonprofits and in the UN and all these other NGOs. But what we really need to remember is that we do not have international regulatory, we don't have any of that. So even if we have policies in our own countries that will make a difference to how we basically, I don't know, fight a future of impending doom. I mean, I don't want to be bleak, but what we should know is that without regulatory authorities, without it being made, how do I put it, obligatory on everyone to follow a certain standard in order to completely avert a crisis, I don't see how we can go forward as countries, as regions, I mean, even as tiny communities, with how we go about this crisis. And what I may be talking about may seem a bit abstract, but the thing is, I mean, this is what it is. We have a capitalistic economy all over the world. It is whatever we use, and whatever is left gets wasted. And it's the same with climate change, actually the climate crisis. If I've seen smaller businesses follow the circular economy. Circular economy is basically like you don't really waste stuff. It's not a straight line. It's like a circular loop. You don't waste as much. You circulate whatever resources you have used into the process for whatever product you're trying to make. But the thing is that as individuals, we are still trying, and we are advocating for a much safer world and for a world that we actually take care of. And of course, there was the natural capital concept that was introduced by Fiona. I would want to recommend everyone to read this book I just had by chance lying right here, which is called Small is Beautiful. It's an amazing book. It's by it was, I guess, published, I don't really remember when it was published, but it's a great book. It talks about how we can basically charge the natural capital. I mean, not charge it, basically how we can provide for it in a way. And while I completely understand the power we wield as individuals, but the thing is that without systemic change and even systematic change, the future as on this planet for human beings, for all species actually, it will be a bit, it would be unpredictable. And honestly, I think I have kind of lost my train of thought by this point because, so, but.
If it's okay, Sidra, I'll bring it back. I know you work in analyzing data that talks about how climate change has impacted poverty in many cases and vulnerabilities in places like Pakistan. And I understand that you're doing that comparative analysis also between different regions in Pakistan as well. We would love to hear a little bit about what your findings in that research has been and how you think it's best addressed.
So with regards to poverty, the role poverty can play, and just like Flavia mentioned, that climate justice on ground is completely different. Not everybody gets the same kind of policy response. For me, for example, I've been working on Karachi. I've been trying to see, with a team of other researchers, of course, how we can measure poverty using energy metrics. How we're trying to observe that. And we do know that every single region, depending on the social, what kind of social average there is, what the kind of people that live there, that's the kind of policies they receive. So for example, if I go to a richer part of the city, policies would be, what we see there is completely different to when we go to a poorer part of the city. And this will become the norm with regards to even climate adaptation strategies, because people who have enough financial power will get those rights, but people who don't, they won't, because they will be further dragged into a cycle of poverty, and it would perpetuate until they will be completely vulnerable, and it would be a very hand-to-mouth situation for those communities. So with regards to policies, and another important part of these policies are that not everybody, even within a single community, not just a country, adaptation to them would be something completely, it would be native to them. It would be something that they would be able to sustain for the future. Because what happens at the moment is all these international donor agencies, that the funding that we do get for crises such as floods and droughts, they decide what should be done in our country for those communities, even if it doesn't work for them, if it's something they have not known, for example, for our agricultural communities. And that's the thing, kind of breaking it down and working with the local bodies, working with the local organizations in order to draft what should basically be done. And so that's very important. It's kind of like a deconstruction of the hierarchy and the status quo, and how we should go about all the entire process of how we will go forth in a world where the climate crisis is ongoing, and we see it on a daily basis, and extreme weather is going to get worse, and it's going to be more often. And kind of breaking it down to smaller communities is much more feasible, it's much more sustainable, and communities will adapt themselves with their indigenous knowledge, or I mean, I don't like using this word because it kind of marginalizes communities, but I mean, of course, that's not what I mean, but it's the knowledge that we already have as communities, and this overconsumption. And even when we talk about consumption, we never really talk about sustainable consumption, mostly. So it's these things. It's the current system of economy that is leading to this crisis, and it's kind of working on policies that complement all these different communities, the entire world, and it's not a single specific part of the world deciding what happens to another part of the world, only because they have the wealth and the power to make a difference.
Absolutely, and Sidra, I couldn't agree with you more. I think when we talk about any form of international law, it's always a little bit scary because it's always the little guys against the big ones. Whenever we're talking about transboundary issues, as Shelton would point out, it's always a question of where do you pin the liability? Who's going to be the one who produces the redress? to combat the impacts of climate change. And to be fair, these have been structural barriers in international environmental laws for a very long time, which is why we look at alternative solutions, a human rights rhetoric be one of them, or literally anything else. But overall, it has to be, as you and both Flavia mentioned, individualistic efforts. But another individual who's working on vulnerabilities, Angelique, coming in from the Seychelles. I am currently in Bangladesh. I think both of us sit on the panel for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and with COP26 coming up, I think it's important to have a discussion of what the future, at least in the immediate next few years, look like, because you're working on the field with climate negotiations. How do we get these bigger nations to listen to all of our troubles? Because at the end of the day, international law is a matter of consent, and it's not been great at the moment. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the speakers who went before. Super interesting. Flavia, I don't promise I'm going to run for elections, I'm afraid. But kudos for definitely taking up that challenge. No, it's a great question. And I'll sort of tie into a lot of what's been said. First off, with regards to the issue of where does power lie, and money and power. And I think one of the things that's very interesting for me is the fact that human rights makes it into the preamble of the Paris Agreement, therefore acknowledging its value, although it remains aspirational in the sense that it does sit in the preamble. We don't have a provision or mandatory provision on the issue of human rights. So and apologize for going too legalistic, but that is its placement and its reality. Now, is there another avenue or another forum for consideration of human rights issues? And many actors, many researchers have appreciated that. Yes and no, right? So in some respect, we know when it comes to loss and damage, which is a topic of consideration in the climate change negotiation, one of the issues, of course, is the fact that liability, responsibility, potential for compensation is very sensitive, to be very diplomatic, a very sensitive issue. And as such, what we find is we have a provision in the Paris Agreement, Article 8, on loss and damage, but then we have this decision accompanying it that says this does not mean there's any issues of liability and compensation. And this is that attempt, right, to move away from it. But it's been, we've seen countries when they have ratified the treaty, they have indicated that although that decision exists, it only applies within the UNFCCC, which means that we can turn to other treaties to explore that potential for human rights consideration as it links to climate change. And there are many. People have looked at different forum, including the Law of the Sea, which is what I know best. So there are opportunities to do that, but there are many factors which would affect success with regards to taking up a case as it relates to climate change. Just to give an example, so people sort of connect with the real issue. If we have high warming temperatures and all the coral reefs in the Seychelles die, as the IPCC report has indicated, I think it's going to be 75% will go at 1.5 degrees and something higher if it's at 2 degrees or something to that effect anyway. And if that happens, food security is going to be a huge issue in the Seychelles. Our coral reefs go, the food that we eat go, the livelihoods of the coastal communities gone. So as such, already we see that human rights issue arising. But then, who takes responsibility? It's your citizens, the state, that vulnerable state that had very little to do with this happening, take responsibility? Or is there action needs to be taken against the polluters? And there are different avenues. Do you go against sort of the country, or do you go against the private sector businesses that have been sort of the worst polluters in time? But I think going back to the issue of power and money, what I have found and what I've seen is that although to an extent, human rights may not be the centerpiece within COP, when it comes to migration, it is of great importance. Everyone cares when it comes to migration. And in fact, the Task Force on Displacement under the UNFCCC has been one of the most successful. And that is because they've had resources from countries and organizations that are very worried that they're going to have people flooding their borders because of climate-related impacts. And we have seen many organizations, many discussions, a lot of policy work, what kind of policy should be placed, a lot of research going into this. And it makes you wonder, why this and not collapse of ecosystems? It always boils down to political issues, very much to what Flavia has been saying, right? If I was a politician, my people would feel threatened to think that a group of people would end up on our shores, try to take out jobs, blah, 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 less resources, spreading it across just wouldn't work for us. It's best that we have this conversation very early because I don't want to deal with the impact. And I'm willing to put money to it because I know my constituents will be very upset otherwise. And also concepts of national interest. And all of this is interesting because it's playing out in a global context where some of us may not make it and some of us will because of availability of resources and power. So in that regard, there's will. If there's an issue that is attractive and appealing to those with power and money, it will get dealt with. And I think the point was made earlier that people generally understand, well, some policymakers, I should say, are generally moved by issues of natural capital. So putting that value, and perhaps that is the direction that we need to go into. I still think that as advocates, we need to have the buffet because different things appeal from different people to different people. And as such, yes, human rights, yes, environment, yes, thinking about does your relative in the Seychelles, if they end up without a country one day, if that moves you, then that will go, And with regards to COP, yes, COP is coming up in November, fingers crossed in person, but because of the inequity of vaccine distribution, we know it may mean that we do have a virtual or mixed COP. But the issues right now is, of course, some outstanding questions about loss and damage, of course, Article 6 with regards to cooperative approaches, and bearing in mind that Article 6 is a financing mechanism that would provide resources to developing countries, and that remains outstanding. And Brazil, I'm looking at you, a very strong player in the Article 6 discussions. So these are issues that are outstanding. We've seen the UK presidency do its best to really try and make it as inclusive as possible. We've had many discussions as small island developing states with the UK presidency, and now there's a whole task force on access to finance. But there's one thing that I have to say as a negotiator and as an advocate and an activist on climate. When you get into these negotiating rooms, you somehow manage to forget that it's less about the commas and the square brackets and more about the people on the ground. And we get so absorbed by positions, interests, and the square brackets that every so often it's good for us to take some time out into the civil society space and realize what is it exactly we're fighting for. So I'll end it on there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angelique. And I couldn't agree more. I'm going to dovetail off of that discussion and just literally rip a line out of Hamilton, the play by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Nobody was there in the room when it happened. Whenever you get into these discussions, you never know what's being discussed. And in the vast majority of instances, you never know what the underlying tones of this is. there are a couple of authors who I think make very interesting points on these notions with regards to how collective responsibility needs to work. I think one of the things that the world has collectively seen over the last few years is just the specter of apathy that has loomed about us for the longest time. Greed and avarice is what basically led to us having to discuss climate change now, because everyone's taken a little bit more than they probably should have. But it's time that we start considering that redistribution. If we're going to talk about Article 6, I think redistribution is where it begins. It's then where the negotiations make the most impact. Who are we negotiating with? What are we negotiating on? How do we make sure that these guys they have the best interests in mind? But they usually don't, because everyone's self-interested. But how do we get them to care a little bit more? Because at the end of the day, and I'm going to again rip out from our poster, the point is to care. With regards to loss and damage, I think you make a very interesting point as well. How do you then address point and damage? I think Costas Dessounas makes an interesting point in one of his articles that he published with, I think, the Georgetown Law Review, where he talks about there being a bare minimum threshold with regards to human rights issues, or with regards to what, the bare minimum threshold beyond which you can't let an individual fall. The fact that climate change is going to result in vast amounts of lands being overtaken by either water or XYZ or whatever other forms of pollution there is, the fact that individuals are being impacted in terms of their health in Delhi because of the amount of the pollution there, the fact that a heat wave very recently took out 22% of the crop production in Bangladesh for a season. All of these are threats to life, health, subsistence. All of these need to be considered. Everyone has collectively contributed to climate change. Everyone needs to collectively respond to now providing redress and redistributing resources in order to make sure that things get better. And I think that needs to become a very focal discussion, whether it be at COP or whether it be anywhere going forward. But thank you so much, for Angelique, for bringing all of this into focus. I'm going to circle back again to all of our speakers one by one. I'm going to bug Fiona and get her attention to ask your opinion. I noticed you were writing stuff down. So what did you think of all of the speakers and all of the opinions flying around? But more importantly, as someone who's actually out there fighting the battle on a regular basis, what do you think we need to be doing next?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I was writing stuff down just because I was thinking, like, every time somebody said something, I was like, oh, that's such a good point. I want to jump on the back of that. But obviously that's not how a panel discussion works. But yeah, it's just really interesting just writing down stuff. So some of the stuff I wrote down was like, well, even things, well, to tie that into your question, Shaf, what do I think needs to be done next? I suppose for me, everything kind of comes back to action, because everything we've been talking about is kind of logistical, like what is the most effective way to take action to solve this enormous problem. So for me, in my kind of in my situation, I suppose, so as a young graduate who doesn't have a huge sphere of influence but would like to do good for the climate crisis, for me that question was about career. I was thinking, what's the most impactful way that I can do something about the climate crisis? And I kind of applied for a whole bunch of jobs, and the one I got was in forestry, and it just happened to be a very practical, manual labor, hands-on job, which for me was kind of surprising, because I suppose, when you're university educated and things, and maybe people can relate to this, family and parents expect you to go into certain job roles, and then you end up, literally just digging all day long. Like, it's not, I mean, it is basically unskilled work what I do. It's just planting trees and maintaining estates. But for me, that feels like an impactful thing to be doing, because it's part of the bigger picture. And like we were talking about, individual actions you can do. So it's also kind of funny, because I guess I've been talking about distribution of resources, and in a way, on a personal level, I find that interesting to think about, because it's a very low paid job that I'm in, but I still perceive it to have a very high impact. Whereas I think there are many people in very high paid jobs who could have, I've totally lost my train. Well, basically, I suppose I'm thinking a redistribution of resources in terms of if we're to allocate money to certain things, why is my job not better paid? Because it's got this incredible impact. And that's one of the things that could change to kind of encourage people to become educated about this thing and encourage people into the industry. Because if people, actually there was a question on the Facebook stream that I was interested in. It was somebody talking about, you know, is it only kind of through an anthropocentric lens that we can solve this problem, or can we maybe bring it back to ecocentrism and actually feel a bit more connected to nature? Ideally, it would be awesome if we could get everybody connected to nature. But I wonder if currently the way that we live, you know, a very kind of urbanized, in some cases, society, it's just not possible to get out in nature every day. I feel so privileged because every day I work in a forest, I like work over meadows, and I'm discovering like, you know, loads of species of butterfly that I didn't know existed. I'm like, oh, look, I saw a really pretty red butterfly today. And my flatmate's like, yeah, cool, whatever. You know, for me, it's so important to feel close to nature. But for other people, it's just not. So I guess when we're talking about change and we're talking about action, we're trying to, you know, kind of explore all avenues. So for me, I guess the things that we can do that are most impactful is just encourage everybody to get involved in this topic in a way that they care about, which maybe sounds obvious, but I think that's, for me, the way that is kind of important. And yeah, like I said, kind of just trying to educate people on ways you can do it. And I suppose from my own journey into it, you know, maybe doing something a bit unconventional because you care about something. And then, I don't know. There's just so many things that could be done. Like, where do we even start with that question? So I guess, yeah, that's my answer, is just try and just approach it at all angles and make people care about it somehow, and actually do the stuff that helps, like tree planting, which is a career that not many people would maybe think about, or like influencing people in all the kind of political circles that everybody's just mentioned. So yeah, I wish I could talk about all the things that I wrote down, but I think we should move on to the next person.
It is unfortunate that we are time bound, but honestly, this conversation could go on forever. And Fiona, to be very honest, at least I feel like I should be saluting you for the work that you do on a regular basis. If I do not have the physical competence to actually pull this off, and you've seen me actually work at the allotment and make most of it. So
yeah, I made Shaf do some digging. But yeah, it's like you were saying, you know, like with the tree planting, you know, at the start I was like, oh, I only plant trees, you know, like I am proud to do it, but you know, I always tell other people, they're like, oh, you know, what's your job? And I'm like, oh yeah, I plant trees. Yeah, what do you do? You know, so I feel like everybody in this call maybe has that kind of bit of pride when you know that you're doing something activist. But yeah, Shaf, I think you would be great at planting trees. I don't know what you're talking about.
Let's not even go there. Let's move on to Julie. Julie, you've had experience obviously working in multiple different locations through your e-learning platform. The last time we spoke, you mentioned a couple of situations. I'm not going to go into the details of it, obviously, but I would love to hear your opinion. You've seen so many different versions of different actions being taken by something as strong as the UNDP. How do you think that's worked out? How do you think it's going to be working out going forward?
So yeah, throughout my experience, I guess at UNDP, I've really had the privilege to learn a lot about different initiatives by local communities. And I really want to highlight, I guess, a few things that we could possibly do, like to serve as a solution to climate change adaptation challenges, which have a lot of legal and institutional barriers, as you know. And it was really interesting to hear, I guess, especially from Sidra, because I actually developed a course once on multidimensional poverty indices on different areas. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but I learned a bit about the Pakistan multidimensional vulnerability index. I think that is really important. I really I want to defer to you later, I guess, to talk about that, but I can't believe how important that is to take multiple different elements that are not monetary indicators and learn from lack of food security, lack of education to make some type of policy. And I really also like what Angelique was talking about small island states and loss and damage. I think that is such an important topic. I took a class once where actually a few of my colleagues went to the Kingdom of Tonga and specifically studied that topic. And it is so, so crucial to focus on the difference in bearing the brunt of climate change. So Shaf, you said something like, well, yes, we all have a stake. Every single person has a stake in this, but it's in different ways. We definitely are not equal, unfortunately, when it comes to how we contribute to climate change and who has to adapt to climate change, who is more insulated from those vulnerabilities, to try to tie those together. And then who contributes the least to it. And it's always the ones who contribute the least to climate change, who face the effects the most from climate change. That is the worst human rights violation on a global scale. And oh my gosh, but I guess a few ways that I've seen to make it less doomsday, a few ways that I've seen this work really, really well in local communities facing a global or local issue, something I guess as broad spectrum as climate change, and taking the opportunity to maybe change what they do is at least in the US, which is where I've lived my whole life. There are a lot of Native American tribes and a lot of local communities that are really, really making a difference. To cite one case study, there's a tribal group in California that has lost the majority of their land over the time, at least their historical ancestral land. And to this day, a few years ago, they only had maybe 10% of their ancestral lands. What does that say?
It just says, stop CVF nations from drowning. That's a desperate attempt of getting people to not let my country drown, or same with Angelique's, actually. But go on, Julie. I'm so sorry for interrupting.
That's okay. No, it's definitely true. Oh my gosh. But
it's just, when you talked about the vulnerabilities, that triggered me.
Sorry. I know. Exactly.
Go for it. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Right. So, there's a lot of different local communities making a difference. I guess if we want to talk about a bit about maybe the legality of different land areas, I think one way to try to get over that barrier is to talk about marine protected areas and the establishment of that and all the nuances of those things, because they are something, like you said, Chef, earlier, like they are transboundary and they require almost an international treaty to create, and they are beyond national jurisdiction. So creating a marine protected area of some sort across boundaries, or maybe a peace park across land boundaries, those are some solutions to bringing countries and communities together to protect land or coexist with wildlife or develop sustainable alternative livelihoods for those communities that are frankly sustainable, things that give people a sustainable income, things that enhance food security. These solutions also mitigate climate change in many ways and also help people adapt. It builds their climate resilience. And so I won't get too much into the details because I know we're short on time, but there's so many amazing stories that I want to tell you about.
We would love to hear them. Again, please just hit us up whenever you want to. Let us know the stories, because the more we learn about this stuff, the more effective solutions we can look towards. On that note, I'm going to ask Angelique to jump back on, because we were just talking about vulnerabilities and that spectrum. And I know that there's a part of me that really wants to discuss redistribution from a progressive like from the lens of how we look at progressive taxation, can we look at progressive redistribution with regards to climate change and its impacts? It's a very legalistic question. I apologize, but I know for a fact that Angelique has obviously had a lot more experience in terms of negotiating all of these issues. So I'd defer to her and her knowledge on this matter. How do you think we go forward on that particular front?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, right? Because, I mean, in many ways, if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, that was almost like a progressive taxation system, right? Because you had established targets for developed countries, and then everybody else sort of tried, but, you know, wasn't bound by anything. And I mean, I don't particularly think Kyoto was a failure, but sort of the jury seems to suggest that, you know, it didn't work, hence we needed Paris. And Paris is not well, perhaps it is a bit of a progressive taxation system, but you decide your tax. And I think that's perhaps one of the challenges is it still goes back to these issues of will. And, you know, we've seen now that there's the synthesis report that the UNFCCC has just released with regards to the nationally determined contributions and, you know, in short, the climate change plans of countries that they've submitted to the UN. And it's very clear that we are nowhere near the level of ambition that we need to be. You know, some countries actually didn't make any change from 5 years ago. And here we are in the Seychelles, and I'm very involved in this process. We're a small island developing state every day discussing how are we upping our ambition? How are we going to be using nature-based solutions to save ourselves, but also to save the world, because it's a global ecosystem service that we would be providing should we protect all the seagrass meadows in our exclusive economic zone, right? So I think it's a difficult one. And because of the nature of international law, you need all countries to, you know, if I don't want to go into the meaning of consensus in the UNFCCC, but essentially we need everybody on board in order for things to go through. So that makes it particularly difficult. So I guess in terms of my answer to sort of your first question, you know, what do we need? We need less excuses. We need just to get on with it. We need to just get on with it. And I have to say, we need to also reformat our narrative, right? Because it's not, we shouldn't be saying, you need to stop certain lifestyles that you've enjoyed in order to give us the world that we need. But perhaps we need to say, are you willing to move and take action for cleaner air? I would like to breathe cleaner air. Everybody should like to breathe cleaner air. Perhaps that positive narrative of what we know is a better world if we take action against climate change may move things in a different direction. But as I say, everybody's moved by different things. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Nope, but thank you very much, Angelique. Yeah, everyone is moved by very different things, because I think at the end of the day, it's just to be all fancy pants about it. If we look at that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, everyone's going to be at different levels on that scale. And therefore, I'm talking about within a structure of just looking at humans individually. Everyone's going to look at different aspects of how to look at climate change. So I'm going to, on that front, pass the ball to Sidra and ask you, how do we then get, say, the most vulnerable individuals slightly more incentivized to act on the climate change advocacy front, and vice versa? Those who've achieved everything that they have and those who have the power, how do we get them to actually care about those who are still struggling to climb up that hierarchy?
Thank you for that.
It's a loaded question. I apologize.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, honestly, this is a question that usually does, it is something I do think about. At the moment, honestly, I don't think there is one answer for this, but the one thing I do think about often is, with the system that perpetuates poverty and like we see that the Western middle classes, they're shrinking. They've been shrinking. It's poverty, of course. I mean, the system we're in is the richer get richer and the poor get poorer. It's a very layman sentence, but I mean, it is what it is. This is the truth. And incentivizing the rich to actually do something. And this just brings me to the question that was asked on Facebook, where they asked about, do you think only an anthropocentric argument would make a policymaker pay attention to climate change? I mean, it kind of relates to that question, because it may not be the only way, but it might be the only effective way to get the attention of not a policymaker. I'm a policymaker. I make all these policies, and nobody needs my attention in order for them to survive on this earth. But I mean, I would try to help with that. But the thing is, trying to get the attention of those in power and those financially, I mean, really, really secure, like billionaires, for example. That's going to take some thinking, because even with like how there's Jeff Bezos, he is investing, I don't know, I forgot the number, but he was investing a large sum in climate solutions. And I mean, Bill Gates is doing this, essentially the same thing. All these people are doing this, but the thing is, there is always the flip side, which is it is always for profit. And certain things just cannot be for profit. And I think it's the entire system that, I mean, it is radical when you speak about it that way, because capitalism isn't going anywhere. Yeah, sorry, thank you, Shaf. It's $10 billion that Jeff Bezos, there was that $10 billion fund. And it's not much, to be honest, but I mean, it is a big amount. And the flip side is that it has its own profiteering angle to it, which I don't necessarily agree with. But we need radical changes with systems and with our models of economy, because without that, it's not just going to get better. I'll be very honest and straight up about that. There's nothing we can do in order to avoid what's going to come to us. And I apologize for all this negativity, but I mean, what we can do is change systems. I mean, if we can, that would be great. If capitalism, it can be altered in a way that supports a world that is cared for, and our natural capital is actually considered to be capital, I think that's a way forward. I think that's something the UK is also doing with their post-Brexit agricultural policy. I'm not sure how much of it is implemented, but their farmers, like their agricultural policy, farmers used to get these basic payments every month before Brexit. Now they get paid for the natural capital which they can charge, like taking a stroll in their field, or I don't know, going to parks. They kind of charge for how you enrich these ecosystems, and that is something very progressive for me. I was really fascinated by that. I actually left the UK before I could see any of that happening, but that is a way to go forward. And I mean, there is no one answer to how we can actually incentivize the rich to do something, or the powerful to do something about, I mean, I think they're just gonna go to Mars or some other planet, which is not possible, but I mean, honestly, but there is no one answer. And thank you so much for that question. That just kind of made me more confused about what can be done.
Apologies. Terraforming Mars or terraforming a extraterrestrial body probably is not it's not in the horizon, immediate horizon. But I'm pretty sure we can find out ways of legally holding a lot of people accountable so that they act on their responses. I remember Dr. Eleni Franzou at Durham University, where I was a student, spoke heavily about horizontality, the concept of where you use international law to hold in private individuals accountable for their actions, as opposed to using this, just holding the state accountable. So I think that's an aspect where we can look towards getting a lot of rich and powerful individuals involved. Like, we know of companies like Chevron, BP, and I'm going to stop naming names for legal reasons now, but like plenty of them have, kind of gotten ahead and spilled in various different areas of the world. Oil spills aren't uncommon. And yet every time one way or the other. It's very difficult to bring legal action against them because of the structure of the environmental laws in different countries and how each country has adapted to it differently. I think, which is why I personally think that human rights aspect is so much easier. You can just go like, hey, wait a second, the oil spills are literally killing off sea life, which is disabling farmers from actually being able to fish in that area. I mean, fishermen from actually being able to fish in the area, and you're impeding their livelihoods. That's one aspect of it, but definitely holding these guys accountable, I think, is a starting point where we can maybe start getting them to move towards being a little bit more friendly.
On that note, just something really small. But the thing is, not individuals, these organizations who do cause so much damage, they're only held accountable after a certain level of damage has been observed, which is a very big problem. It's the fault within our own regulatory frameworks that make it perfectly legal for certain things to be done and for the environment, for certain effluents to be released into the atmosphere. It's actually working in the structure of these frameworks, kind of adapting them in a way that will prevent such large-scale destruction in the first place. But yes, of course, holding them accountable is the way forward.
Absolutely. I think, again, when we spoke earlier about the bare minimum threshold, that threshold needs to go a little bit higher. Definitely. We've got to start reassessing where we're starting to pay attention. On that note, though, let's move on to Flavia to end this discussion on. Flavia, how do you think, having actually played the game of politics, having played the game of having now run 2 startups and inspiring so many people to go ahead and join the climate change advocacy front, what do you think we need to be doing at our individual levels to get either our friends involved, our families involved? How do you get that mandate running?
Yeah, I think there is no right or wrong answer here, because it depends on who you are talking to. But just, I think we can really connect it with what you were talking about, like companies' responsibility and everything else, and government responsibilities. I think everyone is responsible in a way, but we have to pay attention because climate change is already an injustice per se. So we have to understand who is on the game and who is playing what on that game, so we can address that issue better. Just following the questions that they send on Facebook as well, like the argument that you could make policymakers pay attention to climate change is the same question is asked, how can I make a friend of mine pay attention on climate change and anything else? We have to understand the language they are used to. So if I'm talking to maybe a policymaker, they are more interested on understanding how they are going to, develop that specific public policy, or how they can get more funds to their municipalities or the states or whatever. So we know the conversation is going to be more related to making profit on climate change in a way, like on innovation or whatever. It's a way to bring policymaker on the table, putting them in the game as a player, as a key player on the development of climate adaptation, for example. So if I'm talking like to a friend of mine or a family of mine, normally it's, Angelique, you said something interesting when it was like, we don't have to tell them you have to change 100% upside down the way you live, It's not the way. I think the narrative, it's the key here. So, and you have to, it's people like, I don't know, maybe a high class on that live in, I don't know, in New York or Sao Paulo or whatever, they have their swimming pool and they sleep under air conditioner. They have to adapt in a way, but we have to bring a narrative that it's sexy, in a way that it's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting to make that movement, so they can come on board. It's different if you are going to a kind of a vulnerability area in your city. They don't have air conditioner. They don't have even trees around there, because on islands here in Brazil, for example, it's really hard to find green areas there. So it's even hotter. It's different to talk to them about adaptation. We have to bring a different narrative there. Maybe find a way to planting more trees. Is a way here in Brazil we have like to fight even the government, so we can provide the water system there, the saneament system there as well. So there's like different ways of talking about that issue. But in my individual life, like in the way that I do believe example is the best way to improve, is the best way to connect with people, is the best way to create that wave that we want to. So I try as much as I can to adapt my lifestyle in a sustainable way. I'm far away to be perfect. You know I have plenty of steps to build on in a way, so I can see that I'm reached the goal of being 100% sustainable. It's not easy in a society that everything goes on the other hand of that, but I try by example. And once I'm trying by example, friends of mine ask, why you stop eating meat? For example, I still eating fish a little bit. I'm trying slowly to not to, but still. And I said, because I don't know, I was curious to see how my body was going to behave, or I know the impact of meat in my country, or the whole systemic, chain of explaining why meat is related with climate change. Or I try as much as I can to have my water bottle, or even the clothes I buy, it's on a circular economy and whatever, but I fly, so I take flights, and we know the carbon emission of that. So that's the thing. I'm not 100% perfect, and I'm far away because I'm human, and we have just to showing by example ways of doing it. I have it's a silly example, but I remember when I was working in a company and I was the only one with my cup. So every single time I was drinking water, I didn't take a new plastic cup to drink water. And one of the people from the staff asked me, so why are you doing that? I said, yeah, because I don't need 10 plastic cups in a day to drink water. I can have my own. And in 2 months, the whole staff had their own cup. And in 6 months, the whole company, they decided to give to their employees their cup. And I didn't impose anything there. I was just living, walk the talk. I was just living the way I believe, and the example inspires people. I think that's the way we can influence the structure, by example. If we start imposing, I don't believe that's the right way to go, because when you impose something, we create some kind of, resistance instantly. So, but no, when it's by example, it's more fluid. People, when they are ready to, they are going to join. If not, at least they start thinking about it, and it's slowly. But if in an individual level, government level, private sector level, we need examples, but we need a different kind of demand, to them. So they have to take actions. There is no excuse anymore to take action. So I think you have to understand with who you are talking to, so we can have empathy, and you can create the better narrative to those who you are talking to.
Thank you, Flavia. I'm going to dovetail off of that and say, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's a bit of an impetus in all of us to be a bit more conscious about what we're consuming. If we're talking about government or we're talking about corporations, if we buy a little bit more green, look towards buying products that have less packaging, look towards products that are not shipped all over the world before they become a final sellable shelf product, we might get a little bit further in trying to get corporations to then cater to those ideas. If you're greener, you get more sales, or at least that's the hope. But yeah, collectively, it's a little bit difficult every time when you start talking about changing for climate change. I'm not a very good example. I'm a horrible, horrible example, if anything. But I would like to start. And I think it's always difficult because it makes us all uncomfortable when we begin. But the best thing I can say is that if we all collectively start and did our little bits to try and help the climate out, we can all collectively face the challenges, which means if I'm miserable because I can't eat red meat for a week, hey, at least I've got a friend who's going to go through the same thing and we can whine about it together. And on that note, we're going to have to unfortunately end what is or has been an absolutely delightful conversation with everyone here. I'm just going to take a second to note a few things. I am very grateful for everyone who's joined. You've taken your time out from your individual time zones, and I understand we're spread across the world on this particular platform, and it's not been easy. But I do want to say thank you. Thank you to all our viewers who have joined us from all over the world as well. We hope that these panel discussions continue to be good and continue to inform you. This is why Mazel Tov exists. And on that note, we'll see you again. Bye-bye.